Live now to Ottawa, Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland is testifying before the Emergencies Act inquiry.
Strains on supply chains. That was jeopardizing Canada's recovery from the COVID recession in areas like the lack of semiconductors, putting real stress on our car sector. To give just one example of very specific supply chain problems that we were focused on and thinking about. The second area we were really focused on, which again has moved more into what everyday people are talking about, but we were focused on it already in January, was we could see, partly because of those strained supply chains, that inflation was elevated and rising. And so it was apparent, I think, to us that we were going to be moving from the COVID recession situation, where the challenge was, prevent the greatest downturn since the Great Depression in Canada from really taking hold and scarring the Canadian economy. That had been the preoccupation during COVID. We knew that we were moving into an environment where the challenge was reopening and elevated inflation. And how do you deal with that? And that made us particularly concerned again about the supply chains, because they posed a challenge to elevated inflation. So I would say that was kind of my finance minister budget-related set of concerns. The second economic issue that I was very focused on in November, December, January, was the U.S. Build Back Better legislation, and in particular their proposal on EV incentives. And, I realized to an Ottawa kind of maybe legal community type audience, that might seem a little bit esoteric. But the reality is, and it might seem a little bit esoteric and a little bit specific, the EV incentives as proposed by the US, and that legislation made its way through the House in the fall in the US, I believe in November. That legislation as proposed would have been completely devastating to the future of the Canadian car sector. What the incentives would have done, had they been passed into law as initially proposed, is create very strong incentives for buying electric vehicles that were made in the US, not North America, just the US. And EVs, that's a nascent industry, right? We're just shifting to the production of EVs. Imagine if you are a car company, and all the car companies that produce cars in Canada operate on both sides of the border. Imagine these powerful US incentives are put in place, but they only apply to EVs and batteries made in the US. Are you going to build anything in Canada? Are you going to put any of those production lines in Canada? And the answer is you wouldn't have. And, these incentives, frankly, were quite intentionally designed to drive all of the building of the new fledgling EV industry into the US only, and to create a powerful economic disincentive to build any of that in Canada. That would have been a disaster for us, because EVs are the cars of the future. And to just give you a final kind of sense of how significant this was, at the end of 2021, Marrying, the trade minister, and I sent a letter which we made public to the US, warning that Canada was prepared to retaliate at scale.
All right, we'll leave it there for now. We may dip in again later. Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland testifying before the Emergencies Act inquiry today in Ottawa. The Prime Minister will answer questions tomorrow.